Hello and welcome to Senior Code Review Buddy. My name is Chris, and today I'm going to talk about how I've dealt with an encoding bug that broke a podcast program I've written. A few months ago, I released a video about how I used unit testing to help me fix a different encoding bug in this same project. I'd hoped that this would be the last time I would deal with an encoding issue with this project, as I find these issues tricky and annoying to deal with. But it wasn't the case, and I ran into another issue encoding related recently. And this made me revisit and finally address one of the biggest weaknesses of my projects. The fact that my tests mocked all of my interactions with Android devices. So I didn't have any integration or end-to-end tests. So let me walk you through how this bug finally got me to address this issue. Let's start with the crash itself. Now, this error is pretty similar to the last encoding error I had, so it was a lot easier for me to parse it this time. So if we go down, we can see that the code throwing the error is in CP1252. So we've got some part of the project that is running with CP1252 encoding, which is kind of the default Windows encoding. I'm trying to get the whole project to run with UTF-8 encoding, so this is telling me that somewhere I'm not correctly specifying the encoding, and instead of using UTF-8, it's fallen back to the Windows default. And then this default is failing on certain UTF-8 strings that aren't valid in CP1252. At a high level, with this understanding, this fix should be easy. I just need to look up this stack, find the place that I'm failing to set the encoding to UTF-8, change it to UTF-8, and we should be good to go. And if we look up the stack to the first part of my code, we can see that it's in a call to subprocess.run in sync phone to backup folder. So let's go look at that call site. And here we've got our call inside Android phone. So this code is interacting with my Android phone. And this particular call is just a call to a small shell command to just do ls on the podcast directory on the phone. But I do this just to get a list of all the files that are currently on the phone. I use this to sort of keep a backup folder on my computer in sync with the phone. Now, if we look at this call, there isn't anything here talking about encoding, but when I did look up the docs for subprocess.run, I know that it has an encoding parameter, which I can set to specify the encoding that the launched process is going to use. So it seems like a simple fix. I just need to add encoding equals UTF-8 to this call. I wasn't sure at that point how to test it and verify that change. I could make sure my code stopped crashing now by running it, but that isn't a test and it won't verify that I don't regress in the future here. So as I'd mentioned, all of my interactions with Android and tests are mocked. So all the subprocess calls to ADB are just mocked out. And since the error is happening inside this call, if I want the test to verify it works, I can't mock it out. Which means if I want to test this properly, I need to get this command to actually return some text that is valid UTF-8, but not CP1252. And that means I need to have something that ADB can communicate with. So at this point, I decided I needed to cross a bridge that I've been thinking about for a long time, but have avoided until now. I needed to set up an Android emulator that I can use in these tests. I needed to start having integration tests. While I made this choice, I initially made a bit of a mistake when I started the work. We are now back where our crash occurred, and looking at this code, all we need to trigger the crash is to have an Android device with a podcast file in this podcast directory with a name that is a valid UTF-8 name, but not valid in CP1252, because this shell command will get the name, return it, and then we'll crash trying to process it. And when I describe it that way, I hope you can see how you could write an integration test for this function to hit this condition. It doesn't sound too complicated. But when I first started working on this, I kind of missed that. I'm not sure why, but I was thinking that the only way I could trigger this error was with a full end-to-end test. I didn't think about just copying over the file directly and then calling this function on my own. Now, would having a full end-to-end test be great for this project? Yes. Oh yes, it absolutely would be. But it was a bigger solution than I needed right now. Currently, when I run my project, it crashes. So my focus should be on fixing this crash. And the way to do that is by finding the minimal test that triggers that crash and land that test with the fix. So what was the impact of me not following this basic principle and thinking about an end-to-end test instead of just an integration test? Luckily, it wasn't too bad. It resulted in me starting with 2 unnecessary PRs. I had one PR that finally isolated all of my settings into the settings file, because to run an end-to-end test, it needed to be able to set its own settings. So I finally did that. And I had another PR that added a very basic end-to-end test. It just ran when there were no podcasts or shows at all, just basically making sure that the no-op was a no-op. And it was after committing this basic end-to-end test that I realized I could just have that smaller integration test I sort of talked about earlier. And as I made that realization, I was kind of tempted to actually just carry on with making the full end-to-end test and using that to fix the situation, as I felt a bit silly doing this prep work I had just done if I didn't need it. But I was able to accept and realize that feeling kind of silly about this work being kind of wasted for this fix wasn't a good enough reason to ignore what I knew was the correct way to write this test. So I wrote up the integration test for that function, and it was as simple as described before. I just needed to copy some UTF-8 files onto the Android emulated device and then called the function. So what was the final workload for fixing this issue? In the end, it took me 9 PRs, including those 2 initial ones, about 550 lines of code, and 2 new binary files. And what was the final fix in the end? All we needed to do is add encoding equals UTF-8 to this subprocess.run call. Every other change I did was related to testing or interfaces to be used by testing. So how do I feel about having my production code so greatly outnumbered by my test code changes? Honestly, I don't mind. I'm actually kind of happy that I finally got around to addressing the biggest hole in my testing for this project, the fact that everything related to Android was mocked out. And I was able to follow up this work with some additional end-to-end tests that do actually work with files, not just an empty one. And I have a lot more faith in my code now because it's actually all running under test. I also realized in this process that there were a few other problems in my code base that I should fix. Not bugs per se, but code smells that I found. But I'll save that for another video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button below and subscribing. If you want to see my Android emulator code, I've added a link to it in the description below. It's slightly hard-coded for my setup, but still could be interesting to look at. Maybe you have some suggestions on how I should do things differently there. If you have any other comments, code you'd like me to review, or ideas you'd like me to talk about, please leave a comment below or reach me at chris@seniorcodereviewbuddy.com. Thanks, and have a great day!